The laughter came first. Not the warm kind. Not the kind that lifts a room and loosens shoulders. This laughter had edges. It rolled across the studio like glass beads across marble, sharp and bright and impossible to ignore. From his seat beneath the hot television lights, Dean Martin heard it ripple through the audience in waves, some people clapping, some whistling, some glancing sideways as if unsure whether they were supposed to enjoy what they had just heard. The host stood a few steps away, still smiling, still holding his cue cards, still basking in the echo of his own punchline. It had been delivered as a joke. It had even been structured like one. But as the sound reached Dean, it landed not like humor, but like something careless that had missed its mark and struck bone instead. Dean did not move right away. He didn't shift in his chair or reach for the glass of water near his elbow. He didn't look at the host. He let the laughter pass over him first, let it spend itself. Years in front of crowds had taught him something most men never learned: silence. When used well, was louder than any comeback. And in that brief pocket of quiet he allowed himself, Dean studied the faces in front of him. Some were amused, some uncomfortable. A few, he noticed, weren't laughing at all. They were watching him, waiting, measuring the space between insult and response. The invisible distance where dignity either stands its ground or collapses. The joke had not named him directly, not in the obvious way. It had been dressed up as commentary about entertainers of a certain era, about the kind of men who smiled too much, who hid behind charm, who made people forget they weren't. Really that serious? The host had chuckled as he said it, raising his eyebrows toward the crowd, inviting them to fill in the blanks. Everyone in the room knew who had inspired it. The cameras had even cut to Dean for half a second too long. As if the director himself sensed the tension and couldn't resist letting the audience see it. In that fraction of time, millions of viewers at home had leaned closer to their screens. Dean folded his hands loosely in his lap. He had built a career on laughter, on ease, on the illusion that nothing weighed on him. But illusion was not the same as absence. There were things he carried that never made it into songs or monologues. The weight of nights when applause faded too quickly. The echo of rooms he left quieter than he found them. The memory of people who had spoken carelessly then vanished, while the words they'd thrown stayed behind, like fingerprints on glass. The host was still talking, padding his joke with a follow-up, something lighter, something meant to smooth the moment. Dean barely heard it. Instead, he found himself drifting backward, to a smaller stage, a thinner microphone. A time when he was not yet Dean Martin, but Dino. A young man with a borrowed suit and a voice that trembled just enough to remind him it mattered. He remembered a club where a man in the back had shouted something cruel when he missed a note. He remembered the heat in his face, the way his first instinct had been to fire something back, to match sharpness with sharpness. And he remembered the older pianist who'd leaned over afterward and said, "Son, you don't protect your name by swinging at every shadow. You protect it by deciding which shadows aren't worth moving for." The studio lights hummed softly. The audience was settling. The host finally turned toward him, extending an open palm. "Dean," he said, in that practiced tone that suggested generosity, while quietly placing a spotlight, "you've been in this business longer than anyone. You must have heard every joke there is. What do you think?" For the first time since the laughter began, Dean lifted his head. He didn't smile right away. He let the moment breathe. Somewhere in the balcony, a camera zoomed in. At home, living rooms went quiet. He could have dismissed it. He could have laughed along, tossed out a one-liner, kept the show moving. He could have done what he had done 100 times before, but something in the room felt different. Not hostile, not explosive, just thin. As if one careless word more could tear something that wouldn't easily be mended. Dean rose from his chair, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same unhurried motion he used when stepping onto a stage to sing. He adjusted his jacket. He took one small step forward. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Funny thing about jokes," he said, eyes resting not on the host but drifting across the crowd. "They only work when everyone knows what they're laughing at. And why?" A few people chuckled, uncertain. The host smiled, relieved, assuming this was going where most television moments went. Toward charm, toward safety, Dean continued. Most of my life, I've made a living trying to help people forget the hard parts of their day. That's a privilege, but forgetting isn't the same as pretending. And sometimes, a joke doesn't pretend. Sometimes it points. The room was very quiet now, and when it points, Dean went on calmly. You can either wave it away, or you can take a minute and look at where it's aimed. He turned his gaze back to the host, not accusingly, not warmly either, simply present. You didn't mean harm, he said. I believe that. But there are people watching tonight who've been told their whole lives that if they smile, they must be shallow. That if they don't raise their voice, they must not stand for anything. That if they make it look easy, it must not have cost them much. A murmur passed through the audience. Dean rested one hand on the back of his chair. So I'm not upset, he said. But I am going to take this moment. Because sometimes the calm thing to do is to draw the line where it actually belongs. The host's smile had softened. He nodded slightly as if giving Dean permission to continue. Though it was clear now that permission was no longer relevant, what Dean did not say, not yet, was how many times. He had watched people be reduced to caricatures. How many careers he had seen bent by a single careless label. How many young performers wrote him letters saying they loved his ease, but feared the world would never take them seriously. If they carried themselves the same way, he didn't say those things yet. He felt them, steady and insistent, lining up behind his ribs like quiet witnesses, out in the dark beyond the lights. Someone leaned forward in their seat. Somewhere else, a producer raised a hand, then lowered it. Unsure whether to cut or let the moment run, Dean took a breath, and in that breath, a choice settled. Whatever he said next would not be a joke. It would be a drawing, and once drawn, it could not be unseen. The silence that followed Dean's last sentence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if something invisible had stepped into the center of the studio and everyone, from the men in tailored suits in the front row to the technicians behind the cameras, could sense its weight. The host stood with his cue cards pressed lightly against his chest, no longer smiling, no longer sure whether this moment belonged to him at all. Dean, on the other hand, had never looked more at home. Not because the lights favored him, but because he was no longer performing. He was present. And presence, when it arrives without apology, has a way of unsettling rooms built on control. Dean shifted his gaze back to the audience, letting it travel slowly, deliberately, as though he were meeting them one by one. He could see the small details from the stage that television cameras rarely caught. The woman in the third row who had stopped clapping halfway through the joke and never resumed. The young man near the aisle whose grin had faded into something more thoughtful. The older couple who sat with their hands folded, not in disapproval, but in attention. These were not critics. They were witnesses, and Dean understood that whatever happened next would live far beyond the walls of this studio. It would live in living rooms, in late-night conversations, in the private thoughts of people who had been told too often that silence was the safest response. I learned early, Dean said, his voice steady, almost gentle, that the loudest person in the room usually isn't the strongest. He's just the one who's afraid of the quiet. A ripple moved through the seats. Not laughter, recognition, and entertainment, he continued, is full of loud moments. Big lights, big applause, big personalities. But the most important things that ever happened to me didn't happen under spotlights. They happened in the quiet. In hallways, in dressing rooms, in the space right after someone thought the show was over. He paused, and in that pause, something remarkable occurred. The audience leaned forward together. It was not a conscious movement. It was instinct. Dean could feel it the way a singer feels, a room lean into a note. He rested his thumb against the edge of his chair, grounding himself, and allowed the memory he had been holding back to finally surface. There was a young man, he said, a long time ago, talented, nervous, carried himself like he was borrowing space instead of owning it. He worked on a variety show, back when variety shows were the whole world. One night during rehearsal, he missed a step. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make a few people laugh. One of the writers made a joke about it. Not on the page. In the room, something about how some performers were built for mistakes, because mistakes were all they had. A low murmur passed through the studio. The kid laughed. Dean went on. Because that's what you do when you don't know you're allowed not to. But afterward in the hallway, I found him sitting on a crate, staring at the floor like it had personally offended him. I asked him if he was all right. He said yes. Then he said it again. Louder, like volume could make it true. Dean's eyes softened, not with sadness, but with a kind of protective clarity. He told me he didn't mind jokes, that jokes were part of the business. But then he said something I never forgot. He said, "Mr. Martin, when they laugh like that, I start wondering if maybe they're right. If maybe I really am just something people step around until something better comes along." A woman in the front row lifted her hand to her mouth. Somewhere behind the cameras, a technician shifted his weight. I sat next to him, Dean said, and I told him something that had taken me years to learn. I told him that humor is a tool. Like any tool, it can build or it can bruise. And sometimes the difference isn't in the words. It's in the power behind them. He looked back toward the host, not accusingly, but unflinchingly. Because when someone already has the stage, already has the crowd, already has the microphone, even a small joke can land like a decision. The host nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. He did not interrupt. Dean inhaled, then continued, his voice gaining not volume, but depth. That young man didn't quit. He stayed. He worked harder than anyone. He learned to make people laugh on his terms. Years later, he won awards. People lined up to shake his hand. But once, after a show, he found me again. He was older, calmer. He thanked me for that night in the hallway. And then he said something else. He said, "I still hear that joke sometimes, but now I know it doesn't get to tell me who I am." The studio exhaled as one. Dean straightened slightly, the memory settling back into him like a letter returned to its envelope. "So when I hear a joke that paints someone into a corner," he said, "I don't hear comedy first. I hear opportunity. An opportunity to decide what kind of room we're building. One where the quick laugh wins, or one where people walk out a little taller than they walked in." The tension in the studio had shifted. It was no longer sharp. It was charged. A producer glanced toward the clock, then away from it. The cameras did not cut. No one wanted to be responsible for breaking this current. The host finally spoke, carefully. "Dean," he said. "I didn't intend, I know," Dean replied gently, and the interruption did not feel rude. It felt like reassurance. "And I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to give something back to the room. Because intention doesn't always travel alone. Sometimes it brings consequences we didn't invite." He turned once more to the audience. "Every one of you has laughed at something that didn't feel right," he said. "And every one of you has stayed quiet afterward, because quiet felt easier than naming it. I've done that too, for a long time. Tonight, I'm just choosing different." The words did not thunder. They settled. And in settling, they changed the air. But what no one yet realized, not the host, not the audience, not even Dean himself, was that someone else was watching from beyond the first few rows. Someone whose career had been shaped by that same casual cruelty. Someone who had once been on the receiving end of a harmless joke that closed more doors than it ever opened. And as Dean paused, preparing to step back, that person stood, a single movement, in a room of hundreds, and the moment tilted because the line Dean had drawn was no longer theoretical. It was about to be tested. For a fraction of a second, no one noticed the movement. The studio had grown accustomed to stillness. Silence had become the atmosphere. Then, somewhere beyond the first tight rows of celebrities and invited guests, a shape unfolded itself from a seat. Not abruptly. Not theatrically. Simply upward. A man rose to his feet. The shift rippled outward like a dropped stone in water. Heads turned. A camera hesitated, then swung. The host paused mid-breath. Dean, who had just begun to step back toward his chair, felt the change before he saw it. Years on stage had trained him to recognize the difference between ordinary attention and the kind that reorganizes a room. He followed the subtle pull of it, turning until his eyes found the man standing beneath the wash of aisle lights. He was not young. Not old either. His hair was threaded with gray, his jacket a little too formal for an audience seat. As though he had dressed for an occasion no one else knew was scheduled, he did not wave or call out. He simply stood, hands at his sides, his posture careful, as if he were holding himself together from the inside. The audience watched him the way people watch someone step to the edge of a high place, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether they were about to witness courage or collapse. "I'm sorry," the man said finally. His voice was not loud, but it carried, threaded with attention, microphones were designed to catch. "I didn't plan to speak. I came to watch." He swallowed, the movement visible even from the stage. "But I can't sit through this without saying something." Not after what he just said. The host lifted a tentative hand, caught between protocol and instinct. "Sir, this is a live, I know," the man replied, quickly, respectfully. "That's why I'm standing." His eyes did not leave Dean. "Because live is the only place this ever mattered." A low hum moved through the audience. Dean took one slow step forward, not to assert control, but to close distance. He did not gesture for security. He did not motion the man to sit. He did what he had done all night. He allowed, "What's your name?" Dean asked. The man hesitated, then spoke it. It was not a famous name. It did not stir recognition. That, in itself, seemed to steady him. "I used to work in this industry," he said. "Not on camera. Writing rooms. Production meetings. Places where jokes don't echo. They decide." A few people in the front rows shifted uncomfortably. These were the rooms power preferred to keep invisible. "I was there," the man continued, his voice gaining firmness as memory replaced nerves. "When a young performer was labeled safe, that was the word. Safe. Not exciting. Not strong. Safe." They said it smiling, like they were giving him a gift. But safe meant he wasn't trusted with anything that could change a room. He became the guy you put in the middle, never the one you built around. Dean did not interrupt. He felt the man's story assembling itself the way storms gather, quietly, piece by piece. "One afternoon," the man said, during a development meeting, someone made a joke about how he'd probably still be smiling when they replaced him. About how some people were so used to being the background that they didn't notice when the scenery changed. Everyone laughed. I laughed. His mouth tightened, because laughter is a passport in those rooms. You don't show it, and suddenly you don't belong. The studio was utterly still. "That performer," the man went on, "was my younger brother." A breath moved through the audience. Audible, collective. "He never heard that joke," the man said. Not directly, but he felt it. Doors closed. Calls stopped. Meetings that used to run long suddenly had somewhere else to be. "He told me he felt like he was disappearing while standing in full light." The man's hands curled slightly, then relaxed. A year later, he left the business. Not in anger. In relief. He said he was tired of auditioning for rooms that had already decided who he was. The host had lowered his cue cards. They hung loosely now at his side. "I stayed," the man said, "and I kept laughing. And I kept being part of rooms that thought words didn't travel. That jokes ended where they landed. Until tonight," his gaze lifted, locking fully onto Dean. "When you said that sometimes a joke is a decision, I felt like someone had finally named what I never had the courage to challenge." He took a breath that trembled, then steadied. "So I stood up," he said, "because my brother's not here too. And because if I sit through one more moment where a room pretends that laughter can't shape a life, I don't think I'll recognize myself when I get home." The silence that followed did not ask for applause. It refused it. It asked instead for something heavier. Dean felt the weight of it settle on him, not as pressure, but as responsibility. He had drawn a line with words. Now a man had walked across it carrying a history that did not belong to television. Dean stepped fully into the open space at center stage. He did not speak right away. He studied the man not as an audience member, but as someone who had carried something too long without being asked if he needed help setting it down. "Thank you," Dean said finally, "for trusting this room with that." He paused. "And for loving your brother loudly enough to speak for him." The man's jaw tightened. His eyes shone. Dean turned slightly, including the audience without losing the man. "This," he said, "is what I meant when I said opportunity. Because now the question isn't about a joke. It's about what we do when someone hands us the truth that grew in its shadow." He looked back to the host. "We can go to commercial," he said calmly. "We can move on. Or we can stay with this long enough to let it do what it came to do." The host did not answer immediately. His face had lost its practiced ease. What replaced it was not panic, but something rarer on television: consideration. Somewhere offstage, a producer raised a hand. Another lowered it. No one spoke. The man in the aisle was still standing, waiting, and in that waiting, Dean felt the old instinct rise, the instinct to smooth, to soften, to protect the show. He had built an empire on that instinct, but he had also built a life. He drew a breath, deep and unhurried, because the next thing he chose would not only shape the room, it would decide whether the line he had drawn was decoration or direction. The moment did not break when Dean finished speaking. It stretched. It thinned. It trembled like a held note that no one was ready to release. The man in the aisle was still standing, hands now loosely clasped, shoulders no longer braced but not yet at rest. The host remained motionless, his eyes moving between Dean and the audience, as if searching for a script that did not exist. Somewhere beyond the camera arc, a red light blinked, steady and indifferent. The broadcast was still live, and for the first time that night, no one in the room could pretend they were only here to be entertained. Dean felt the quiet move through him, not his nerves, but his clarity. He had lived long enough to recognize when a moment was not asking for polish. It was asking for truth shaped carefully enough to be carried by others. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, enough that the first row no longer felt like a separate world, and rested both hands lightly against the back of his chair. He did not raise his voice. He narrowed it, the way a man does when he wants to speak not to a crowd, but through it. "There's something we don't say out loud in this business," he began. "We say it to each other, sometimes, in hallways, in jokes. But we don't say it where people can hear it breathe." He looked briefly at the man who had stood, then let his gaze widen. "We pretend that only talent shapes a career, that the stage is fair, that the audience decides everything. But careers are also shaped in rooms with no windows, by sentences that never make it into print, by labels that follow people into places they were never spoken." Faint, uneasy movement passed through the front rows. These were people who had lived in those rooms, people who knew the furniture. "I've been protected by my reputation more times than I can count," Dean continued. "There were seasons when my smile opened doors before my work ever could. I don't pretend otherwise. But I've also watched the same smile, on a different face, be used as proof that someone didn't deserve a chance to carry weight." He paused, the memory visible in his eyes, not as pain, but as accounting. "And every time we let that pass because it arrives dressed as humor, we teach the room what it's allowed to erase." The man in the aisle drew a breath that shook his chest. Dean noticed. "So tonight," Dean said, "I'm not interested in who meant what. I'm interested in what stays after we leave." He turned slightly toward the host, not as an adversary, but as someone extending responsibility. "Because every show ends, but the way people feel when it does, that doesn't." The host finally spoke quietly. "Dean," he said, "you're right. And I need to say this, not as a host, but as a person in this industry." He swallowed. "I didn't think about who that joke might stand in for. I didn't think about the rooms it might remind someone of, and I should have." The admission was not dramatic. That made it heavier. Dean nodded once, not in triumph. In acknowledgement, he turned back to the man. "Would you come closer?" he asked. The request traveled through the room like a current. The man hesitated, then stepped forward. An aisle opened. People shifted their legs back, their programs, their coats, making space not just physically, but symbolically. When he reached the edge of the stage, Dean descended one step. Not to elevate the man, but to meet him. "What was your brother's name?" Dean asked. The man spoke it. Dean repeated it once, carefully, as if setting it somewhere that could be seen. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing him into this room." He turned to the audience again. "This is the part we skip," he said. "The part where someone becomes more than an example, where a story becomes a person." His gaze swept the seats. Every one of us here has been on both sides of a laugh. The side that gives it. The side that wonders what it cost. The only question that matters is whether we use that knowledge to make better rooms. Or quieter ones. "Oh," a producer's voice murmured from somewhere off stage, barely audible. A hand signaled that time was nearly gone. The broadcast window was closing. Dean felt it. The gentle pressure of an ending. He chose not to rush it. "I can't undo what anyone has been told in rooms I wasn't in," he said. "But I can tell you what I decided a long time ago. I decided that if I ever had a microphone, it wouldn't just be for singing. It would be for naming the things we pretend don't need names." His mouth curved slightly. "And if that ever made the show less comfortable, I was all right with that." He turned back to the man one last time. "Your brother mattered," he said. "He still does. And tonight, a lot of people heard him through you." The man's composure broke, just enough to let something reel through. He nodded, once, deeply, as if accepting something he had not expected to be offered. Dean stepped back onto the stage. The host joined him. There was no formal wrap-up. No bright sign-off. Only a room of people who had witnessed something that would not fit neatly into a highlight reel. The director counted down. The red light dimmed, but the room did not move. For several seconds after the broadcast ended, no one applauded. No one spoke. They simply existed together in the quiet that had been earned. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not loudly, permanently. Later, headlines would try to summarize it. Articles would argue over whether it had been necessary, whether it had been appropriate, whether it had been good television. But the people who had been there would remember something simpler. A man who did not raise his voice. A joke that did not get the last word. A line that was drawn without anger, and therefore could not be easily erased. Dean returned to his chair. He picked up his water. His hand was steady, because some strength does not announce itself. It just remains, and in remaining. It teaches rooms how to rebuild themselves if you want. Next, I can create for you.